This episode of Wheat Pete's Word is brought to you by Syngenta. Stack the deck in your favor in 2025 with a stacked cereals lineup of crop protection products from Syngenta. With proven technology for exceptional disease control and greater plant resilience, you'll find game-changing solutions for your wheat crop. Visit syngenta.ca for more info.
Good day, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 500 of Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture. On this episode of the Word, top yields, wheat survival, red clover, sulfur, nitrogen credits, and more. Let's go! So yes, a milestone, 500 Wheat Pete Word episodes. That is 146 hours roughly of Wheat Pete over 6 24-hour days. If you have listened to every episode, oh, that is just a lot of listening. And so an absolute huge thank you to all of my listeners. If it weren't for you, we simply wouldn't have any fun doing this, and doing the Word is always the highlight of my week. Nature Nut Nick, I'm sure you're listening, so I expect you are at that 24-hour days of listening to Wheat Pete's Word. Don't forget, when we started this game, I think I hit 100, and I said 100 episodes, we're going to 1,000. Nature Nut Nick said, do you know how old you're going to be, Pete, if you actually make it to 1,000? Well, Nick, I made it to 500. That's a passing grade. We're going to keep going as long as we can. Lots of fun from that perspective. So again, thank you for listening. Episode 500. And what an awesome way to kick off episode 500, but with a phone call from Mark Deischer. He called me up Saturday and he said, Pete, I just want to tell you that listening to you and talking with you over the last 4 years, I entered the Pennsylvania State Wheat Yield Contest, and guess what? I won the Pennsylvania State Yield Contest, and I'm 5th in the nation, so 5th in the U.S., and Mark said, you know, I pretty much all credit it to listening to what the Real Ag Wheat School videos are, to talking with Wheat Pete, and to making sure we get the basics right. And man, that is so key. If you get the basics right, you're well on your way. We're always looking for the magic silver bullet. Man, it rarely exists. Get the basics right. So, Mark, thank you so much for such a nice way to kick off episode 500. Mark from Michigan also sending me an email saying, Pete, what about tram lines? Do they make sense? And so the answer is absolutely. Tram lines make sense. They're better than tramping the wheat, because as we've talked lots on Wheat Pete's Word about wheat populations and about spacing in the row. And so if you have the wheat growing in 7.5-inch rows, the wheat beside the tramp lines until they get tramped, and even after they get tramped, that wheat is sensing those wheat plants beside. It's not utilizing the sunlight. If you have the tram line there, then you don't get that competition from those plants. Oh, a little bit more weed pressure because you've got those wider rows. I get that. But you will do better with tram lines than tramp lines. And Mark said, hey, thanks. I'm working on growing great wheat. When he responded, yet again, what a way to start off episode 500 and Wheat Pete's Week, but to say growing great wheat. Meanwhile, I talked to my great friend Paul Sullivan in Eastern Ontario. I said, Paul, what should I talk about on episode 500? And Paul said, you know, Pete, I think you should look back and tell people what is different at episode 500, basically 10 years. What is different than 10 years ago? You know, Paul, at the end of the day, I've been doing this now for, I think, over 40 years. And guess what? Still talk 90% the same things. Just as Mark Deisher said, it's the basics, it's the basics, it's the basics. Oh, there's a few things different. We have tar spot now. We have soybean cyst nematode. There's some things along the way that have evolved. New diseases, new insect pests, which will continue to evolve. But the basics are the basics, and for the most part, that doesn't change. Sulfur, we've added in sulfur. Still, though, it comes back to those basics. And to prove that, man, things don't change. So Sheila, my wonderful wife, is reading some of her Facebook posts, and she sees a decorator that she likes to watch, and the decorator is talking about her distilled water machine sitting on her countertop. And Sheila was compelled to bring it to me because what the write-up said was, I love my distilled water unit. It takes out all the Roundup and the chlorine and the fluorine out of the water. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, we're still fighting that battle. By the way, the fluorine is put in the water for tooth decay. The chlorine is put in the water to keep the bacteria from developing. Like, all of these things are actually benefiting your health. Meanwhile, we have to use distilled water to take them out. And we don't want Roundup in the water. I get that. But there isn't much in the water, and it's way below any level that would harm you. But that was the first thing in the post, was taking the glyphosate, the Roundup, out of that water. Gosh, Paul, there's not that much difference after 10 years. Okay, I want to move on, because the other thing is not different is, oh my gosh, it's February. We have to kill the wheat crop. And so Adam, and I really do appreciate, by the way, Adam Pfeffer, great agronomist down in Elgin County, works with Bayer. And he was getting tired of all the garbage on Twitter, and he said, let's get back to agriculture. Okay, Pete, how long can my wheat snorkel under this ice? And we do have a lot of ice. So the short answer is that the wheat is dormant. It's not respiring much. What happens under ice is it runs out of oxygen. And so at low respiration rates, it doesn't take much oxygen to keep it alive, but it does take some. So after about 2 weeks, if it's truly encased in ice, we start to worry. The question is, does the ice crack? Is it solid? And actually, Adam said, what about running over it with a rotary hoe? Adam, if it's that frozen that the ice will carry your equipment, then the rotary hoe won't work. Adam said, oh, it's really frozen under the ice. I don't know about that. There's quite a bit of Ontario soils that are not frozen. So be careful with that. And the rotary hoe is not enough, 100%. But I really liked Bob's comment. Bob said, oh, come on. Worrying about wheat in February is simply wasted energy. And yeah, nothing we can do about it. Let's wait and see. Meanwhile, Dan from Idaho reaching out saying, all right, Peter, how cold can wheat actually take it? So in Idaho, they typically have lots of snow. They had 2 days of 50 Fahrenheit. That's 10 Celsius temperatures. And Dan said, like, how long can it take it? It's going to drop to 0 Fahrenheit with no snow cover, or maybe a little bit below 0 Fahrenheit. So it really does come back to the variety. Fortunately, Dan said that the variety he's growing is really cold tolerant. So the really cold tolerant varieties, the maximum that I've seen is about minus 21 Celsius, which converts to minus 6 Fahrenheit. If it goes to minus 1 or 2 Fahrenheit, you should be okay. But some of our Ontario varieties that aren't as cold tolerant only stand at to about minus 12 Celsius, or that's plus 10 Fahrenheit. So it will depend a lot on the cold hardiness of that particular variety. Hopefully you're okay. Once again, nothing you can do about it this time of year, so we'll just drive on. A great question from Lou. And by the way, Paul saying, hey, Peter, I've seen the first red clover applied in fields here just south of Woodstock. Dean saying, "Oh, Peter, I'm so tired of winter. It's so long this year. When is meteorological spring start again? I can't wait." Dean, that's March 1st. And it looks like it's going to be winter till March 1st from the forecast that I've seen, that's for sure. But red clover applied on the snow, you kind of go, wow. Couldn't have been much snow, but there are parts of Ontario that don't have a lot of snow. And interestingly enough, red clover applied on snow in February is not like applying urea on snow. Urea on snow melts the snow, it moves with the water, it ends up where we don't want it. Typically, that black red clover seed will attract the sun, and it will melt its way as every time the sun hits it, it will warm up more and melt a little of the snow around it faster, and so it will work its way down to the soil before the snow melt generally really happens, unless we get the big thunderstorm. So if you can get that job done, I wouldn't argue with it. I like it better when there's not snow, because then you know you don't have that worry. But yeah, already accomplished some red clover applied. And that was Lou's question. So Lou from Quebec used to get great red clover stands. He's been doing it for about 10 years. He heard about it, I think, from us here in Ontario, and he said, man, let's give that a go. He was doing it with his gator, and he was getting excellent stands. But man, 25-foot spread wasn't very time efficient. He started putting it on with his fertilizer. So he was spreading 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate and putting it on with that spinner spreader in a 50-foot pattern. He has not gotten a good clover stand since he started doing it with the ammonium sulfate. And he said, I wonder if we're killing the germ on the red clover, particularly when I get it blended with the fertilizer and it sits in the shed for a couple of weeks. Is that what's going on? So several things to ask. First, Lou, is how long did it sit in the shed? Ammonium sulfate is horrendous for absorbing water out of the air, so the salt concentration could kill the germ on the red clover seed. It's totally different than mixing wheat with MAP in the fall. MAP doesn't take on moisture very quickly, and so it doesn't become wet, so to speak, and we don't have an issue most of the time with damaging wheat germination. Ammonium sulfate, different product. Is there any way that you can just add the red clover to the ammonium sulfate and go spread it immediately? The other real question is, were you getting the red clover on earlier with the gator than you are with the ammonium sulfate? Because timing also makes a difference. But you're right that maybe it could be the ammonium sulfate. So then his question was, well, I can buy gypsum a lot cheaper than ammonium sulfate. Can I blend the red clover with the gypsum? Will that have a negative impact on germ of the red clover seed? And the answer is sure, you can mix it with the gypsum, and it won't have any big impact. It's not going to suck up moisture and impact the red clover germination. But the trick there is, what about the cost? And Lou says, well, gypsum's really cheap, $325 a ton. AMS, ammonium sulfate, $480 a ton. Well, okay, but we have nitrogen that we can credit from the ammonium sulfate. And if you do the math, the nitrogen in the ammonium sulfate is worth about $315. So when you do that math, you have about $165 that you're paying for the sulfur in the ammonium sulfate, and it's 24% sulfur. In gypsum, you're paying $325 for 18% sulfur. Man, that sulfur in the gypsum is really, really expensive if you can use the nitrogen in the ammonium sulfate. I don't know. I think I might go back to the gator. All right, while we're on that, Woody's saying, all right, Peter, I listened to Sean Castile, Ontario Ag Conference. By the way, if you haven't listened to that session, 100 bushel soybeans with horse spawner Sean Castile, you should. It's an awesome session. If you have, you can still register for the Ontario Ag Conference and watch all 50 online sessions. Amazing amount of good information. But Woody is just saying, Well, that 100 pounds of AMS offset the yield loss with no-till soys. And Sean Castile's data, when they put ammonium sulfate on with a cereal rye cover crop. Remember, Woody is a big cover crop proponent. He's trying all sorts of neat things to sort out what works best. And his question was, man, like if that 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate will overcome the yield penalty that cereal rye gives after a corn crop to the soybeans, would it help just in straight no-till 250 bushel corn residue? Could that work? And so my answer, Woody, is absolutely try it. There's also data from Sean Conley. So Sean Castile is Purdue, Indiana. Sean Conley is a soybean specialist in Wisconsin, and he has some new data that suggests 30 pounds of nitrogen will replace a tillage pass in the soybean crop and make no-till soybeans yield equally to tilled soybeans. On the other hand, the other question is, do we really get a yield loss in no-till soys? And I can just hear Tyler and Barry at Brantford screaming, we don't see a yield loss to no-till soybeans. So every situation is different, but gosh, Woody, give it a try and let us know. I'm really keen to find that out. Jason in Northern Ontario, a similar question. Planting soybeans on low fertility sandy loam soils, and he says the economics are harsh. Like, do I broadcast any fertility? It's low soil tests, but it just isn't value or dollars to do it. Jason, if you have low fertility soil tests on a sandy loam soil, I will just about guarantee that spreading some phosphorus and some potash ahead of that soybean crop will give great ROI, return on investment. So for sure, I think you do that. And I think you look at sulfur. You're a cold climate, you're on sandy loam soil, plant the soybeans as early as you can. And in that situation, we really need them to nodulate. And so, gosh, if you need, like if it's first time soys, inoculant, but some sulfur fertility is also necessary. That's the Sean Castile work. I'd look at a little bit of ammonium sulfate there or some gypsum to try to get some sulfur there. I think that's really key. Vern asking, and this again goes back to the fact that I talk about the same things a lot. I know I've answered this before, but Vern saying, AMS, ammonium sulfate versus ammonium thiosulfate versus K-mag versus elemental sulfur. Can I put elemental sulfur on in the fall and replace some of those other sulfate sources applied in the spring? And the answer is no, because the sulfate form of sulfur gets leached below the root zone in Ontario's wet climate. It may not happen in other drier climates, but it absolutely does in Ontario. Some great Minnesota research that looked at elemental sulfur and how finely ground it was. And in Minnesota, if they had micronized sulfur, the soil applied the residual of that micronized sulfur, because it's so available for the bacteria, they saw some decent residual levels coming available in early spring, but still not early enough for what we're talking about with winter wheat or with that nodulation effect on the soybeans. All right, want to move on and apologize to Tom. Tom said, oh my gosh, Peter, really? You threw me under the bus when you said no nitrogen credit for double crop soybeans. Man, I am pretty sure that there is a nitrogen credit. Okay, there is not a nitrogen credit anytime you grow soybeans, full stop. You might need less nitrogen to the next crop, but it's not because of a nitrogen credit. Red clover fixes nitrogen, and it turns that nitrogen over for the next corn crop. Soybeans fix nitrogen about 50 or 60% of what they need, but all of that nitrogen gets taken off in the soybean. So there's no nitrogen credit. In fact, in Manitoba, they looked at residual nitrogen following a range of different crops: wheat, canola, corn, soybeans. The residual nitrogen in the soil after soybeans was the lowest of any crop that they sampled. There simply is no residual. But double crop soybeans have almost no residue, almost no stover stalks, pods left over, because the plants are always short and the yield is decent. Sometimes you can get 40 bushels, but often it's 30 or 25. And so you just don't have much residue. And residue immobilizes nitrogen in the soil. So when I have corn stalks, 250 bushel per acre corn stalks, I have so much carbon that any free nitrogen in the soil gets tied up in the residue. With soybeans, very little residue, so some of the nitrogen that might come available out of the organic matter doesn't get immobilized or tied up the same. So, Tom, could you actually need less? Yep, the answer is yes, you could. But it's not a nitrogen credit because the soybeans take it all off. All right, last, and again, I'm sure I've talked about this many times, but that's what we do on The Word. We answer questions. Paul's saying, Peter, I grew canola. I was going to grow corn this spring. I hear now there's a problem with that. What's going on? So canola does not support the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And because it doesn't support mycorrhizal fungi, and corn being the princess of a crop that it is, it needs all the help it can get. It needs those mycorrhizal fungi to be there and growing. And because canola doesn't support them, they're dormant, they're not there. You grow corn following canola, and you often, not always, often go phosphorus deficient because that is what the mycorrhiza bring to the table. It's why after winter canola, here in Ontario, I'm a big winter canola proponent, but you must, I repeat, must grow something after the winter canola, double crop soybeans, oats and peas, I don't care what, but canola comes off in mid-July, early July. You grow something through July and August to restart those mycorrhizal fungi. And then you grow corn the next year, and you have an awesome corn crop, and everything works really, really well. And with that, I am yet again out of time. That's it. That's all. On behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture, this is episode 500 of The Word for Wednesday, February the 12th. Hey, thanks again so much for listening. Keep the questions coming, and I will continue to do this at least for the foreseeable future. Talk to you soon.